John Allen is a native of Kansas and also a graduate of the University of Kansas, where he took a master's degree in religious studies. He and his wife Shannon alternate living in New York and in Rome because of his work for the newspapers, National Public Radio, and CNN here in the United States. Since 1999, John has served as a prize-winning Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter and as CNN analyst on Vatican affairs. He also appears on National Public Radio. John is known to most of us from his dignified, accurate, but also very touching CNN commentaries at the death of John Paul II and at the election of Benedict XVI. In July 2005, John Allen published an interview with our very own Archbishop J. Michael Miller on the benchmarks of Catholicity for institutions identified as Catholic. While conservative Richard John Neuhaus says possibly the best reporting on the Holy See published in the United States is Allen's All Things Catholic, which you can find on the NCR Cafe on the internet. Even liberal commentator Andrew Greeley calls Allen's Vatican analysis indispensable. The London Tablet dubs Allen the most authoritative Vatican writer in the English language, while Kenneth Woodward described Allen in Newsweek as the journalist other reporters, and not a few cardinals, look to for the inside story on how all the Pope's men direct the world's largest church. Noting Allen's blog this week in his column, on the recent naming of cardinals, this lecture, I suspect, will stimulate a lot of questions and conversation. So that's how other journalists view John Allen, but how does John evaluate his own professional contributions? I was up in Illinois last weekend giving a summary to the CMSWR, the Catholic Major Superiors Organization of the United States. And while there, I happened to look in the bookstore and found this 10 Things Pope Benedict Wants You to Know by John Allen. And I thought, oh, good, maybe there's something in there for an introduction. And sure enough, I found it. In this introduction, John reflects upon his own journalistic experience in this way. The English Jesuit George Tyrrell once accused 19th century biblical scholars who had gone in the quest of the historical Jesus of peering into a deep well and seeing only themselves in the reflection. The phrase has become a metaphor for writers who couch their work as an analysis of some other figure, but who are really projecting their own ideas and visions. Aware of that danger, I don't intend this short interview to be John Allen's version of Pope Benedict. As much as possible, we'll stick to Benedict's own thoughts and words, so that it is the real pontiff who speaks to us. Insofar as I've come to know John in the last 24 hours, I think that honestly depicts what he tries to do in his journalism. He wants to let us have the real person speak to us, and that has been his gift to us on CNN and in his articles. So without further ado, I'm pleased to present John Allen as our 2000-2008 Archbishop J. Michael Miller Lecturer. In gratitude for his tenacity in overcoming the dichotomies between faith and life in both journalism and in the media, and for his wisdom about church affairs on the international level. John.
First of all, is this microphone working? Yeah, good. Sister, thank you for that extraordinarily gracious introduction. Now, I know that you're an exacting academic, so you will forgive me if I correct you on one small point. You described me as a CNN Vatican analyst. I'm actually, I will have you know, CNN's senior Vatican analyst. Now, before you get terribly impressed with that, however, I should also confess I am CNN's only Vatican analyst. Well, I'm senior in a universe of one. This is what they do in TV. Rather than giving you more money, they give you loftier titles. It's a bit like academe in that regard. I want to begin tonight by telling you how delighted I am to be with you. And this is not merely because I am aware of the sterling reputation that the University of St. Thomas has as a catalyst in the intellectual life of the Church in the United States and around the world, although I clearly am aware of that. And it is not only because I am also a longtime admirer of the Basilian Order, which does marvelous apostolic works and seems to produce priests of the highest human quality, although that's also true. But I am especially delighted to be here tonight because I am privileged to count Archbishop Michael Miller among my personal friends. In fact, I jokingly said at dinner tonight that I actually suspected when I initially got this invitation that this was Michael's way of repaying me for the dozens of lunches and dinners I bought for him while he was in Rome. But however it happened, I am delighted to be part of a lecture series that holds up his example and his witness to all of us because he is a truly remarkable man of the church. And you, of course, this is Coles to Newcastle. You all know that. But I just wanted to let you know that I know as well, and I'm delighted to be part of this experience. All right, I've been asked to you tonight to speak about no less prodigious a subject than the future of the Catholic Church. And in order to set up that conversation, I want to tell you a story. You know that Jesus always began his public teaching with a parable, so here's my parable for the evening. Okay? Concerns a man about my age in his mid-40s who is going through that absolutely stereotypical midlife crisis. Okay? And the particular way that he decides to respond to this crisis is he decides to rejuvenate himself. So he seeks out the best plastic surgeon in town and he has the works. Okay? Facelift, tummy tuck, the whole deal. He gets those human growth hormone therapy treatments for your skin that's supposed to rejuvenate your skin. He gets the antioxidant injections that are going to combat the free radicals in your brain. You know, the whole Megillah. And at the end of it, he is feeling terrific about the results and he wants to strut his stuff. So he goes down to the local Barnes & Noble and he picks up a couple of youth magazines and then he waits in line and he pays for the magazines, and as he's checking out, he asks the clerk, "By the way, would you mind telling me how old you think I am?" And the clerk looks at him and says, "I don't know, 31, 32, something like that." The guy says, "You know, I'm actually 47. He says, "That's amazing. How do you do it? You look terrific." Okay, and now he's feeling great, and he wants to do it again. So he leaves the Barnes & Noble, and he walks down the block to the McDonald's. Okay? Now, it's lunch rush at the McDonald's, so he waits in line, gets up to the counter, buys his, whatever, his quarter pounder, and as the teenager is taking his money, he asks, "By the way, would you mind telling me how old you think I am?" And the teen sort of sizes him up and says, "I don't know, late 20s, early 30s, something like that." The guy says, "You know, I'm 47 years old." He says, "That is amazing. My God, I hope I look as good as you do when I'm your age." Okay? Now he's on cloud 9, and he wants one last jolt of affirmation. So he walks out on the McDonald's and walks to the bus stop that's on the corner, and there's a large crowd of people at the bus stop. And he walks up to one elderly lady, and he says to me, "Excuse me, ma'am, don't mean to disturb you, but would you mind humoring me and just tell me, how old do you think I am?" And the lady looks at him and says, "Well, I tell you what, if you take off all of your clothes, run around in a circle and bark like a dog in front of these people, I'll tell you how old you are." Guy thinks, well, that's a little weird, but you know, he's determined to know if he can beat the system, and so he does it. You know, he strips naked, he runs around, he's howling at the moon. You know, things are on the precipice of total chaos. They're calling the police and so on. And so just as things are going to spin completely out of control, he stops, walks up to the elderly woman, and he says, "All right, how old am I?" She says, "Well, I'll tell you. You are 47 years old." I said, that is absolutely amazing. How does that work? She said, I'll tell you how it works. I was behind you in line at the McDonald's. Moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Beware of anyone who stands before you claiming to possess esoteric means of revealing the essentially unknowable. Because if you take them too seriously, you are going to end up naked, running around in a circle and barking like a dog. Now, the truth is, I have no better claim than you do to know what the future has in store for the Catholic Church. Okay? Predictions are always a hazardous enterprise, but I would nevertheless argue that the discipline of trying to look down the line about where things might be going is justified because what it forces us to do is to take seriously the present. That is, to try to sort through, the flotsam and jetsam, the million and one things that are constantly washing across all of our radar screens every day, and try to get our hands around those forces that are truly most elemental, most primal, most pregnant with consequence in terms of shaping the Catholic future. And so that's what we're going to do tonight through the guise of what I am calling 10 megatrends in Catholicism. That is, 10 elemental forces that seem to be cutting through the church and the broader world, and that seem to me truly poised to set the table for the church in the 21st century. Okay, but bit of prolegomena number one is, take any future prediction with a grain of salt. Okay, number two is that what we are engaged in tonight is very much a descriptive rather than a prescriptive enterprise. Okay, that is to say, that I am not here to argue that these are the 10 megatrends that ought to be shaping the future of the Catholic Church. We can actually have a very interesting conversation, and we might get one or two different opinions about what the 10 things that ought to be most important. My claim is different. My claim is that realistically, looking at a kind of level-headed fashion and trying to take a global view, the 10 forces we're going to look at seem to me, and on the basis of my reporting and analysis and travels and so on, seem to be 10 forces that really are likely to be enormously consequential for where the church is going to go in the 21st century. And I say that because whenever I give this presentation, inevitably somebody's going to pop up and say something like, I don't really like that megatrend number 2, or, I think that megatrend 8 is terrific, and what can we do to push it along, and so on. And those are wonderful reactions. Thank God we have Catholics who feel so passionate about the church that they want to push it to realize the best version of itself as they would see it. But in a way, those reactions miss the point. Okay? We are not engaged in a prescriptive debate about where we ought to be going. We're instead trying to take an honest look at where we do seem to be going. Okay, clear enough? All right, with that way of setting the table then, let's get into the meat of it. First of our 10 megatrends is what I call the birth of a world church. And by that, I basically mean the transition from a Catholicism that in the 20th century was dominated largely by Europe and North America to a Catholicism that will be ever more shaped by the experiences of Catholics in the global South, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. This chart shows you what happened to the Catholic population in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, as you can see, there were 266 million Catholics in the world, of whom 200 million lived in Europe and North America, and just 66 million everywhere else, principally in Latin America. This was before the population explosion of the 20th century. So in other words, 100 years ago, only 25% of the Catholic population lived in the global South. 100 years later, look what happened. We had 1.1 billion Catholics in the world in the year 2000, 720 million of whom lived in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, just 380 million of them in Europe and North America. Another way of putting that point is that in the year 2000, 65.5%, that is 2/3 of the Catholic population, lived in the global South. And projections are that somewhere around 2010 and 2015, that number will go up to 75%. That is 3/4, 3 out of 4 of every Catholic man, woman, and child alive will be living in the southern hemisphere, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most profound, most sweeping, and most rapid demographic transformation of Catholicism in its 2,000 years of history. Okay? And it is impossible, I think, to overstate the consequences of what all this portends. But the place to begin, of course, is by making this point, that the famous demographer and social scientist Auguste Comte once said that demography is destiny. And what this destiny means for the Catholic community is that as the 21st century unfolds, an increasing share of the leadership, the political energy, the pastoral imagination, and so forth in the Catholic world is going to be bubbling up from the South. So what is that likely to mean? Well, bear in mind that anybody who starts peddling generalizations about 720 million people, you ought to be a little skeptical, huh? Because for any generalization I'm going to give you about the Global South, there are quite literally millions and millions of exceptions. Okay. Nevertheless, I would argue that the 4 points that I want to touch on this slide do, by and large, hold up as broad generalizations about the kinds of thinking and the kinds of leadership we are likely to see from our Catholic brothers and sisters, including our Catholic bishops in the Global South. So the first point. Let me say, before I get into this, that I don't think these categories of liberal and conservative that we work with in the West, I don't think they translate very well in the Global South. It's not a taxonomy that most people in the South recognize. I remember when I was in Kenya once, I was interviewing a political science major, asking him if he was a liberal or a conservative. I had to spend 15 minutes defining what those terms meant, and at the end his answer was, I'm both. Okay? However, because these terms mean something to us, I think at a rough and ready level, they help us sort of get started thinking about this. So, first of all, I think what you would find is that Southern Catholics, by and large, by our Western standards, would come off as morally and in a way theologically quite conservative, politically and socially quite liberal. And here's what I mean by that. On the kind of hot-button issues that frame the culture wars in the West, things like abortion, homosexuality and gay marriage, divorce, the traditional status of the family, and so on. By and large, the center of gravity of opinion in the Global South, by our standards, is exceptionally traditional and exceptionally conservative. You can see that, for example, in the Anglican Communion today, which is split right down the middle between a very progressive North that is moving towards things like blessing ceremonies for same-sex unions and ordaining openly gay bishops and so on, and a very stalwart Anglican center of gravity in the South that is quite strongly opposing all of that. And by the way, did you know that a majority of Anglicans on the surface of the planet today live in the Global South? There are 79 million Anglicans, 40 million of whom live in Africa. There are actually more practicing Anglicans in the country of Nigeria alone than there are in Great Britain. Okay? And so you see this dynamic of the split between a more liberal and socially permissive North and a more conservative and traditionalist South quite clearly there. But when you shift the conversation to other issues, things like the ethics of free market capitalism and globalization, war and peace, race relations, the environment, social justice questions generally. On those sorts of questions, what you often find in the Global South, particularly among the bishops and theologians, is a climate of opinion that by our standards would strike us as quite liberal, very socially progressive. And the way I try to put that in a soundbite is say that a lot of Southern bishops I've interviewed over the years talk about the World Bank and the IMF the same way that many of our bishops talk about Planned Parenthood. That is the kind of central bête noire of the Catholic Church. And of course, there's a very practical reason for that. The poverty and exclusion that is created in the kind of emerging system of globalization that we see is their front burner pastoral reality. Okay, and therefore no surprise that it would be a subject of great concern. Second, the thought world of Southern Catholicism tends to be very much rooted in the Bible rather than abstract academic theology. That is, the kind of the parables in the New Testament are the touchstone of faith rather than the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, which among other things means this is a very earthy spirituality, and it's one in which the supernatural plays an extraordinarily important role. Okay? Miracles and healings and visions and exorcisms, that may all seem a little esoteric to us sometimes, private revelation and so on. But this is very much meat and potatoes daily spiritual experience for our brothers and sisters in the South. And therefore we can expect the Church, I think, to have a much more lively sense of the supernatural as palpable, close, nearby, very much part of our daily experience. Third, the problems of the Church in the Global South, ladies and gentlemen, are problems of growth rather than decline. And this is an important point to make to audiences in Europe and the United States, because I think looking at our own backyard sometimes, we can be seduced by the notion that the global Catholic story is contraction. Not so. The global Catholic story in the 20th century was of dramatic runaway growth. Okay? Take Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Catholic population went from 1.9 million in 1900 to 139 million in 2000. That, folks, is a growth rate of 6,708%. Okay, sit with that number for a second, 6,708%. And so the real pastoral problems that many Catholics in the Global South have is keeping up with this rapid expansion, trying to build seminaries rapidly enough, trying to open pastoral centers rapid enough, try to come up with programs of Christian initiation for all the new people who are coming into the church and so on. So the problems are trying to keep up with this dramatic expansion rather than, worrying about whether or not the last person to leave the church will be the one to turn out the lights. Huh? And finally, you will find particularly bishops and I would say also grassroots activists in the Global South often play a very directly political role in these societies that by our standards of church-state separation can sometimes seem a bit excessive. I know you had Archbishop Pius Ncube from Zimbabwe among you not long ago. Archbishop Ncube is a perfect example. By our standards, having an archbishop, passing judgment on presidential candidates and the legitimacy of parliamentary elections and so on, we would sometimes scratch our heads over that kind of behavior. But the truth is, in many parts of the Global South, where you have officially one-party states, or you have a political class that is so completely corrupt and discredited that it doesn't enjoy any public confidence at all, quite often, the church is the only zone where a real civil society can take shape, a place where a voice attentive to the common good can be articulated. And so I think you will expect to see the Catholic Church becoming a much more robustly and directly engaged political actor during the course of the 21st century, because that is the ethos of the Southern Church. All right, if our first megatrend concerns the Global South, our second is more concerned with the Global North. It is what I call the emergence of evangelical Catholicism. And here, of course, I'm borrowing a term from the Protestant world to describe a sort of robustly public, assertive form of traditional Catholic identity that we have seen taking shape under the last two papacies. That is John Paul II and now the present Holy Father, Benedict XVI. I would define it in terms of these three characteristics. First, an emphasis on traditional Catholic identity. So reaffirming those things that make Catholicism different from the rest of the world. Our traditional language, our traditional dress, our traditional liturgical practice. Okay? Second, a strong public proclamation. The essence of being an evangelical, of course, is not to hide your fire under a bushel basket, but to shout your faith from the rooftops. A very public form of Catholicity. And finally, third, faith is understood as a matter of personal choice rather than something you simply imbibe from the broader culture. Now, in that sense, this emphasis on strong Catholic identity, this evangelical Catholicism, is in a sense a stepchild of secularization, right? Because it was secularization that has eroded homogeneous Catholic cultures, and it's made the faith something that has to be personally embraced, because you can't count on it being transmitted through the broader culture, through neighborhoods and schools and so on. But it is also, to some extent, evangelical Catholicism, a reaction against secularization, okay, and the threat that secularization poses to the church. This chart illustrates this point, because I think where you see secularization in its most pronounced and overdeveloped form, in a way, is in contemporary Europe. This is the most recent data from the Pew Trust Global Attitudes Project. The Pew researchers run around the world asking people to respond to what extent religion was a very important force in their lives. And these are the percentages in various countries who said, yes, religion is very important to me. Look at the results. In Indonesia, 95% of the population said that, yes, religion is very important. Nigeria, 92%. Okay, Indonesia being an overwhelmingly Islamic society, Nigeria being divided evenly between Muslims and Christians. Guatemala, an overwhelmingly Christian society, 80%. The U.S. clocks in at a still quite respectable 59%. But look what happens when we get into Europe. Poland, ladies and gentlemen, 36%. Italy, the headquarters of Roman Catholicism Incorporated, 27%. Germany, the birthland of the Protestant Reformation, the land of Luther, 21%. Russia, the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy, Moscow is the new Rome, 14%. France, the eldest daughter of the Church, 11%, and the Czech Republic, the home of the Bohemian Reformation, 11%. Point is that Europe is really the opposite end of the spectrum from most of the rest of the world in terms of the strength of religious faith and practice, religious commitment, and so on. But of course, it's not just these numbers. I mean, it's also the fact that in Europe today, the church has in many ways been denied almost any sort of public role. I'm sure you all know the battles, the ultimately losing battles that were fought to get a mere mention of God into the preamble of the new European Constitution, and on and on. Now, never forget, ladies and gentlemen, that the Vatican is a European institution. And the policy-setting level of the church is, therefore, very attentive to European realities. And if this is the reality, it is no surprise that at the policy-setting level of the church, there's an extraordinary effort underway these days to reaffirm those traditional markers of Catholic identity, to make sure that the church is not assimilated to and ultimately seduced by this ultra-secular social milieu. So, what we see today in the Catholic world is efforts to reaffirm traditional Catholic identity in virtually every area of the church's life. Liturgy, certainly, is one classic example. This is why the Holy Father recently issued a document broadening permission for celebration of the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass, the so-called Tridentine Mass, because it is a carrier of traditional Catholic identity that the Holy Father wishes to be more widely available. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, at some parish near you, on a Sunday in the not-too-distant future, when your celebrant says to you, "The Lord be with you," your answer will no longer be, "and also with you." It will be, "and with your spirit," because that is a more faithful translation of the Latin original, "et cum spiritu tuo." This is a decision that has already been made and will be implemented at some time, whenever we have a new sacramentary, which should be in the not-too-distant future. Now, you will misunderstand these developments if you see them as random, isolated events. They are small pieces of a much bigger picture, which is the effort to revitalize and reaffirm traditional identifiers of what it means to be Catholics, to ensure that we, in the end, don't end up doing what Jacques Maritain once famously described as kneeling before the world. That is, prostrate before this kind of secular, relativized milieu. And on and on. I mean, in every area of Catholic life, you can see the same thing. And those of you who are Catholic educators certainly don't need me to tell you the discussions we have had over the last couple of decades about what it means for a university to be Catholic. How we measure it, how we know it, how we foster it, and so on. All right, third megatrend is Islam. And I'm thinking here particularly of the rise of radical Islam over the last quarter century. The pie chart makes the very simple point that if you add up all the Christians and Muslims in the world, you will find that we come to roughly 56% of the human family. That is, we are more than a majority of the human race, which means that by definition, the relationship between these two global forces cannot help but be a major driver of global history, for good or ill. And we've seen evidence of both of those outcomes in recent times. I would say that the rise of radical Islam and the kind of frisson that is out there in the culture about how do we work out a modus vivendi between Islam and the West, it's producing a very complicated response within the Catholic world that I would describe in terms of both a new capacity to push back, that is, to resist Islamism, but at the same time push forward, that is, push forward towards new levels of dialogue with, and I don't like the word moderate, I would think of it as dialogue with traditional Islam. That is, the vast majority of Muslim men and women who are not extremists, but who are nevertheless faithful Muslims, and also people of deep civility, with whom bonds of friendship remains possible. I'm not going to go through every point here, but I'll just give you two examples of each. Under the heading of pushing back, there is no issue that occupies a more front-burner position today in Vatican diplomacy and in the thinking of the leadership class of the Church than the issue of reciprocity. And reciprocity is a Vatican code word for religious freedom. Basically, the idea being that if Muslim immigrants to the West get the benefit of the protection of law and religious freedom, then religious minorities in the 56 majority Muslim states of the world ought to get the same deal. And if you want a living example of this issue, here it is. The mosque in Rome. This mosque was built from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. It is the largest mosque anywhere outside the Islamic world. It has an indoor capacity of something like 6,000 people. You can actually see it from the dome of the cupola of St. Peter's Basilica. And of course, this was not an accident. It was built with the full support, by the way, of Pope John Paul II. When the plans for this mosque were developed in Italy, there were a number of conservative forces in Italy that wanted to try to block it. And John Paul said no, that if we believe in religious freedom for Christians in the Islamic world, then we also have to believe in religious freedom for our Muslim brothers and sisters here. They have a right to build a place of cult. And so the project went forward. It was funded by contributions largely from Islamic governments. Saudi Arabia was the largest single contributor, put in about $25 million towards the project. Meanwhile, in Saudi Arabia today, it is a fundamental aspect of constitutional law that the only tolerated and permitted form of religious practice is Wahhabi Islam. Okay? Which means that it is illegal for Christians to bring Bibles into the country. It is illegal for Christians to wear crosses. It is illegal for Christians to gather for worship either in public or private. And this is not, by the way, just something that everyone kind of winks at. In 2007 alone, of course the year is not yet over, but in 2007 alone there have been 5 Christian house church services. That is, not Christians gathering in a gaudy, splashy church someplace. Christians gathering in someone's living room, where those services have been raided by the religious secret police. The pastors have been deported and the congregants have been subjected to various forms of harassment. In the Catholic world, the ministry of Saudi Arabia and the whole Arabian Peninsula has since the 19th century been entrusted to the Capuchin Franciscans. There are currently 4 Capuchins who are charged with the pastoral care of Catholics inside Saudi Arabia, and these poor Capuchins dare not set foot off the oil industry compounds or diplomatic grounds wearing their habits without the threat of arrest. And it's a real threat. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, there are 1 million Catholics in Saudi Arabia today. Now, these are largely, of course, Korean, Lebanese, and Indian migrant workers, so-called guest workers, although some of them are in their 2nd and 3rd generations in the country. But the point is, in that kind of climate, it is almost virtually impossible for the Capuchins to deliver meaningful pastoral care to these people. All right? So the reciprocity argument is that those kinds of imbalances simply won't cut it. And we are hearing a much more explicit, very clear, unambiguous challenge to Muslim leaders on those issues from the Holy Father on down these days than has traditionally been the case. But at the same time, there is, I think, also an equal commitment from the Holy Father on down to trying to press towards greater partnerships with Muslims where those partnerships are possible. And certainly on a whole range of cultural issues, things like international rights to abortion and family planning policies and so on. The Holy See and Muslim governments have a track record of working together on those issues. At the end of the day, and I will leave you with this thought on Islam, Benedict XVI, despite his Regensburg lecture, despite his much more explicit challenge to Muslims on issues of reciprocity and violence and so on, at the end of the day, Benedict XVI, nevertheless, is not the chaplain to a new anti-Islamic Cold War. He believes profoundly in the possibility and the urgency of dialogue with Muslims, and I'll tell you why. Because the fundamental clash of civilizations that Benedict XVI sees in this world does not run between Islam and the West. It runs between belief and unbelief. That is, it runs between cultures that make room for the supernatural, that recognize the centrality of God, that recognize the need for religious faith and practice, and those cultures that belittle and mock it. And in that clash, which is not exactly coincident with any geographic border, this is a cultural clash. And in that clash, Benedict believes that Muslims should be our natural allies. So I think what we're going to see for the rest of the 21st century is we are going to see this one step forward and one step back, very complex dynamic, where on the one hand, Catholics develop a greater capacity to defend themselves and to push back against excesses of Islamic extremism, but at the same time remain committed to building bridges and to trying to deepen these bonds of friendship. Okay? Megatrend 4 is the new demography, and of course it is called the new demography in contrast with the old demography. The old demography was the population bomb, right? This is what we all talked about 30 or 40 years ago. The population was going to grow in such a runaway fashion that eventually the world would just be full of people and we couldn't support it anymore. Okay, that was the old Malthusian demography. Well, of course, the reality today is quite different. Rather than runaway population expansion, what we are living through today is a period of seemingly permanent declining fertility. That is, ultimately population contraction. What's going to happen over the short term, that is between now and 2050, is that the world's population will continue to rise from the current about 6.5 billion to 9. But that is going to mask tremendous regional differences. Population will grow dramatically in the south. It will contract dramatically in the north, particularly in Europe and in parts of Asia. And this chart makes the point. It shows you fertility rates in Europe today. The red bar is what demographers call replacement level. Basically, the idea is that for a population to remain stable, every woman by the end of her childbearing years should have had 2.1 children. That is, 2 children to replace herself and her husband, 0.1 to allow for infant mortality. Okay? There is not a single nation in Europe today, not one, that has a fertility rate above replacement level. Okay? What that means is that Europe is going to lose population and lose dramatically. As I say here, UN projections are that Europe, this is all of Europe, not just the EU, but Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, will lose 131 million people by mid-century. That's a bigger hit, ladies and gentlemen, than the 14th century Black Plague. Okay? Now, as I say, in the short term, therefore, we will have an aging North and a very young South. But in the second half of the 20th century, the rest of the world is going to catch up with us. Because look at what has been happening to fertility across the global South. The green bars show you fertility at its peak in the mid-60s in a kind of randomly selected set of nations in the global South. The purple bars show you fertility today. Look at Tunisia, for example, which is now below replacement level. I mean, Egypt, which has dropped from 7.1 to 3.2 and so forth. My favorite example is Iran. Iran has gone from a fertility rate in the mid-60s of 7 to, now this is a 2002 number, 2.1. Most Iranian demographers that I know believe that today the fertility rate in Iran is actually below replacement. Now, demographers are not exactly known for their sense of humor, but they have a joke about all this. What demographers say is that in 50 years, the most popular grassroots organization in Iran will no longer be the Hezbollah. It will be the AARP. Okay? Because really, the rest of the world is going to go through the most rapid and dramatic aging of their populations that we have ever seen in human history. Okay? And that is the bottom line of all of this. That beginning in the global north and then radiating down to the south, in the 21st century, we are going to live through a period of rapid, intense aging unparalleled in previous eras of human history. In the United States, the projections are, today there are roughly 34.7 million Americans who are over the age of 75. By 2040, that number will be 75 million, will more than double. Ladies and gentlemen, the 65-plus share of our population is far and away the most rapidly growing segment of our population, growing more rapidly than Hispanic immigration, growing more rapidly than Asian immigration. Okay? It's the elderly segment of our population. Now, that is going to create enormous new social strains, of course, as we struggle to pay for pensions and health care and so on. I mean, most economic analysts believe that the Japanese recession of the mid-90s was the world's first demographic recession. They began to age so rapidly that their pension system essentially went belly up. And the same thing has happened in Brazil and so on. We are going to see that multiplied across the global stage. And it is going to create an enormous new challenge for faith communities because, of course, faith communities, when social systems and families break down, faith communities are always the last line of defense to make sure that vulnerable people have some place to go. Which means that we are going to be called into service in increasing fashion to make sure that this rapidly swelling elderly population is taken care of. But I don't want to paint too grim a picture. I would also argue that this rapid aging is, in a sense, a potential boon for churches. For this reason, all of the data tells us that people don't magically change their worldview simply because they get old. That is, you don't go from being an atheist to being a devout Christian simply because, you cross a calendar and become 65. However, the data also tells us that if you are moderately religious at 35, you are likely to be more religious at 65. The data shows that for every year that goes by, there is an uptick in the amount of interest in religious themes and willingness to devote one's time and treasure to religious causes, which means that we are going to have an explosion in the percentage of people entering that stage of their life where they are most likely to be interested and most likely to be willing to commit themselves to religious causes if our churches have the imagination to make themselves elder-friendly. And so it seems to me at the meat and potatoes pastoral level, that is an enormous challenge facing faith communities, and particularly facing the Catholic community in the United States. I can't tell you how many times when I go around and give talks like this, if the audience skews to the upper end of the age spectrum, okay, somebody will say kind of ruefully, oh my, look at all the gray heads, as if that's a bad thing. Okay? Because, you know, in the popular mythology, youth means energy and life, and old age means death, right? But the reality is that we are entering a period in which an increasing percentage of our population, and particularly within the churches, is going to be elderly, and a great deal of the vitality of our faith communities is going to depend on whether or not we have the imagination to unleash the enormous potential the elder members of our communities have to make important contributions. And I would encourage all of us to be thinking about that. All right. Megatrend 5 is expanding lay roles, and I mean this both inside and outside the church. We are living through a period in which the lay contribution to the Catholic community is in many ways being fundamentally redefined. Now, I put 5 things on the slide here. I'll only talk about 2 examples of the point. First would be the new movements. We have, in the late 20th century, lived through the emergence of an entirely new form of committed religious life. However, religious life not understood in the sense of vowed, consecrated men and women, but lay people with strong theological formation, with strong spiritual formation and so on, but who are remaining lay people and who have taken it upon themselves to try to redeem the secular world from within. So I'm thinking here of groups like L'Arche, Sant'Egidio, Communion and Liberation, Focolare, Regnum Christi, and on and on. I mean, all of these groups are 20th century creations, and all of them share in common the charism or the task of trying to unleash the lay potential, not in terms of being an extraordinary minister of the Eucharist or being a lector or a deary. That is not primarily in terms of performing some task inside the church, but being out there in the world, being a Catholic doctor or lawyer or banker or architect, and trying to figure out how to bring an evangelical sensibility to that task. In other words, to redeem secularity from the inside out. It's an utterly new form of lay life in the church, and we have watched it be born and grow up. Now, inside the church, of course, there is a kind of parallel phenomenon in the growth of lay ecclesial ministry. There are, at present, in the United States, about 40,000 priests, diocesan and religious, and there are 32,000 lay people who are playing the role of a lay ecclesial minister, which means a music minister, a youth minister, a parish associate in a parish that doesn't have a priest, and so forth and so on. At present in the United States, there are about 5,000 seminarians, that is, priests in formation, and there are 18,000 lay people training to become lay ecclesial ministers, which means that it doesn't take a genius to figure out what the future of pastoral ministry in the United States is likely to be. Increasingly, the routine delivery of pastoral care in this country for all those roles that don't require sacramental ordination is going to be carried out by lay people, and this is by no means a uniquely American phenomenon. In fact, it's more pronounced elsewhere. Remember that growth in the global south I told you about a moment ago? What happened in the 20th century is that we created millions of new Catholics, and we created hundreds of new dioceses, but we created precious few new parishes. And the reason is because we don't have the priests to staff them in the global south. So what we created in the global south during the 20th century instead are pastoral centers. These are pastoral centers largely staffed either by lay employees or lay volunteers. Again, the point is that routine, day-to-day pastoral ministry and pastoral care in this church will increasingly be carried out by lay people performing functions once held by priests and nuns. Which, of course, is, carries its pluses and minuses, and we can talk about that later if you want. The chart is simply intended to make the point that whatever you think about the theology of that, whatever you think about the desirability of that, the transition to greater reliance on lay ministers is a basic bottom line quantitative necessity in the church. Because this chart makes the point about the ratio of Catholics to priests in various parts of the world. Look at the red bars in the bottom. That's the United States and Europe. What it shows you is that in the United States, we have a ratio of 1 priest for every 1,321 Catholics in this country. In other words, it's 1 to 1,300. Okay? In Europe, it's about the same. It's 1 to 1,343. My point, ladies and gentlemen, however much you may think there's a priest shortage in this country, it is dramatically worse in most other parts of the Catholic world. Because look at Africa. In Africa, the ratio is 1 to almost 5,000. In the Caribbean, it's 1 to 8,000. In Latin America, it's 1 to 7,000. And in Southeast Asia, it's 1 to 5,300. Okay? So the point is that we can spend a lot of time arguing about the kind of abstract desirability or lack thereof of a transition to a lay ministerial corps. But you look at these numbers, and it is quite obviously a basic bottom line inevitability. Okay? It's the way the winds are blowing. One point I would make in terms of this, I would say, explosion in lay roles inside and outside the church and the transition to a much more lay-led church. There is a kind of untold story about the Catholic Church these days, which has to do with the empowerment of women. As you know, the image, the public profile of the church often is that it is anti-woman because of its position about women's ordination. Well, whatever you think on that question, the reality is that in all of those roles that do not require sacramental ordination, the story of the last quarter century has been an explosion in the representation of women, even at senior levels in the church. And these numbers make the point. In the United States, women now hold almost 30% of senior positions in American dioceses. They are 50% of all administrative positions. 82% of those lay ministers I told you about are women. And even in the Vatican, you can see women serving in new senior-level consequential decision-making capacities. And this, I think, is going to be part of the story of the 21st century. That although I don't think at all there's going to be any movement, of course, in the Church's teaching or ordination, I do think there will be continued momentum to try to make sure that women's instincts and women's experiences are represented at decision-making levels in the church. And again, this is one part practical necessity, and one part something that is quite obviously desirable on the surface of it. All right, Megatrend 6 is the biotech revolution. All of those fantastic new developments that are taking place in genetic science these days that are both expanding the horizons of what we can do to human life in dramatically and mind-boggling new ways, and also creating enormous new ethical challenges. Now, I've listed 8 here, and all of these are in a way ripped from today's headlines. You don't need me to tell you about them. But I would suggest if you sort of traipse through these questions, that is the issues of cloning and genetic engineering and so on, the ultimate philosophical question that will confront us in the 21st century is this: what does it mean to be a human being? In a world in which human life can be manipulated at its most basic levels and at its earliest stages, in a world in which genetic traits can be programmed in a laboratory like so much computer software, okay? Where does the uniqueness of human identity and human dignity actually reside? Okay? Now, any one of these issues would be a good illustration of the point, but I'm going to pick the last one on the list, the issue of chimeras. This is the chimera of antiquity. Okay? It's a multiple-headed monster that was the scourge of sailors in the ancient world. This, of course, is not what scientists mean by a chimera, however. What scientists mean by a chimera is an entity that carries more than one set of DNA, okay? More than one set of genes. Okay? Let me give you an example. There is a scientist at Stanford, a guy by the name of Irving Weissman, who recently did a research protocol in which he injected a small set of human neural cells into fetal mice so that these mice grew up with about approximately 1% of their brains composed of human brain cells. Okay? And then he later dissected these mice. He was interested in studying the progression of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and so on. Huh? Now, those mice obviously became chimeras because they were carrying both mouse DNA and human DNA. Now, okay, 1% of brain material, you may think that's relatively unproblematic. Here's Weissman's new research proposal, which, by the way, has recently got green-lighted by the Stanford Ethics Committee. He proposes to inject a sufficient amount of human neural material into these fetal mice that 100% of their brains will be composed of human brain cells. Okay? In other words, he wants to grow a race of mice with miniature human brains. So, ladies and gentlemen, if this is the chimera of antiquity, behold the chimera of tomorrow. Now I ask you, on the basis of Roman Catholic anthropology and moral theology, what is the moral status of a race of Stuart Littles? Granted, these mice are probably not going to be playing chess or writing essays on a critique of pure reason. But nevertheless, given how central the brain is as a carrier of human personality and human identity, does the fact that these mice are carrying exclusively human brains, admittedly in miniature fashion, Does that somehow change their moral status? Are they now somehow more than animal, albeit still less than human? Do they have new rights, and do we have new duties towards them? Please don't rush to answer, because I certainly don't have a response. My point is that this is an example of an absolutely new ethical question, okay, that we have only been the thinnest scintilla of a response to, and it is the kind of thing that is going to occupy an increasing percentage of our time and energy as the 21st century unfolds. Okay? Megatrend 7 is globalization, and I'm thinking here predominantly of economic globalization. This picture, by the way, if you don't recognize it, is the famous shot of John Paul II meeting with the rock star Bono from the group U2 in September 1999 at Castel Gandolfo. Bono and John Paul, you can remember from that period, were two of the leaders in the global campaign for debt relief for the world's most impoverished nations. And they met in September 1999 at the Pope's summer residence to sort of join forces. Now, I interviewed Bono at the time of the Pope's death, and Bono told me the story of this photograph. Bono, if you know him, his trademark look is he always wears these powder blue sunglasses. Okay? And so Bono wore these sunglasses into his audience with the Pope, and about 10 minutes went on, and he noticed the Pope kept staring at his sunglasses. So Bono thought, well, geez, maybe this is inappropriate, so he took them off and put them in his pocket. Okay? Pope kept staring. Okay? So at the end of this 45-minute meeting, finally he was brought up to be introduced to the Pope, and he noticed the Pope was still staring at his sunglasses. So he said to the Pope, listen, would you like to try these on? And the Pope said, yes, that's what I've been wanting to do for the last 45 minutes. Now catch the point, ladies and gentlemen, this was not just John Paul being cute. John Paul understood that this picture would finish on the front page of all the world's newspapers, and he knew it would communicate in a flash that the church stood with people of conscience, even those who don't share its specifically religious beliefs, on the issue of justice for the world's poor. I mean, this was a genius communicator at work. All right, so in the 21st century, globalization is creating a reality that I think of in terms of a best of times, worst of times dynamic. On the one hand, it is very important that our peace and justice people in the Catholic world not get locked into a knee-jerk anti-globalization rhetoric, which is characteristic sometimes of the secular left. Because it's important to remember that the spread of free market globalized capitalism in the late 20th century has lifted more people out of poverty than at any previous point in human history. I mean, growth in China and India alone, just since 1978, has cut the percentage of the world's population that lives in extreme poverty from 40 to 20%. In that sense, you could make an argument that free market capitalism is the greatest humanitarian program ever devised. Okay, so it's important that we not get boxed into a kind of just instinctively anti-globalization rhetoric. And yet, at the same time, there are deep indicators that something is amiss. We have 1.2 billion people in this world who live on less than $1 a day. We have 10 million children who die every year from poverty-related diseases, things like typhoid, malaria, cholera, diphtheria. Utterly treatable. We have everything we need to treat those diseases except the will to get the resources to the people who need them. And I think perhaps the most telling indicator of the kind of bifurcated outcomes that globalization is producing is that there are three individuals on the face of the earth, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Carlos Slim, whose net worth is more than the gross domestic product of the 42 most impoverished nations on earth. Those three guys by themselves control more assets than 42 countries in the face of the earth. Okay? Now, obviously, this kind of situation is going to cry out for an ethical witness from the Catholic community. Number one, because human dignity is at stake, and the Church is always a voice of human dignity. But number two, and more practically, because these are the front-burner pastoral realities of bishops and activists from the South who will increasingly be setting our tone in the 21st century. Okay? Megatrend 8 is ecology, or you can call it environmentalism. A lot of different points of entry we could take into the issue of ecology, but I want to talk just for a moment about water. This map, those nations shown in white are those nations considered by experts to be at risk of severe water shortages in the 21st century. That is, where there's less than 4,000 cubic meters of water available per capita. Look where these countries are. I mean, they are in places such as North Africa, the Middle East, Indochina, already not known for their stability. Okay? The possibility of conflict erupting around shortages of water, I think, is almost infinite. Policy analysts say that in the 21st century, water is the new oil. I would submit to you that water is actually the new oil cubed. Because think about what happens when oil becomes scarce. Yes, the price of gas goes up. Yes, we might have to line up around the block to fill up our tanks. Yes, global commerce slows down, it becomes more expensive to ship goods and so on. But think about what happens when water becomes scarce. What happens is that people die. They die, number one, because of thirst. Number two, because they begin drinking unsafe water and therefore acquiring the diseases that is carried by unsafe water. And number three, because there's not enough water to irrigate crops, crops fail, famine results. So the destabilizing potential of water shortages is infinitely greater. Now, this is an example of the kind of issue that is going to require an aggressive ethical and social witness from the church. Number one, again, because of our concern for the common good. But number two, because religious leaders can approach questions of water shortages in a way that secular think tanks and NGOs and politicians never can, because, ladies and gentlemen, water in our spirituality and our tradition is a sacramental, which means we can approach this debate with a spiritual, theological, and moral depth that no secular agent possibly can. Okay? And it is an example of the kind of issue that is simply going to require us to take it seriously. Megatrend 9 is what I call multipolarism, the transition from a world dominated by a lone superpower, meaning, of course, most recently the United States, to a world in which power is more evenly distributed around multiple poles. And the candidates that most people tout as the new poles of this multipolar system would be the so-called BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, which already, by the way, their combined GDP is higher than the combined GDP of the United States and Europe together, and they represent 40% of the world's population. The other is the Shia axis, this kind of transnational Shia belt that stretches from Lebanon on the Mediterranean through Iran and Iraq all the way into some of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Probably the single most consequential result of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 is going to be precisely the emboldening of Shia Islam on the global stage, because when the dust settles, it will be the first Arab nation to be governed by Shiites. Okay? Now, what are the implications for Catholicism? Most critically this, that Catholicism has long aspired to be a central voice of conscience in global affairs. But for almost 2,000 years, the mental world that Catholicism inhabited was Europe and North America, which meant that the powers it was addressing were powers that were shaped by the Christian heritage. And however far some of these regimes strayed from Christian tradition, nevertheless, they knew the Christian vocabulary, they knew the Christian mindset. In the world of the 21st century, the mental world of the church for the first time is fully global, and it is going to be a globe in which many of the powers that matter are not Christian and have not been shaped by the Christian tradition, which means we're going to have to learn a completely new vocabulary. And this is why Benedict XVI has tasked the International Theological Commission with developing a new document on natural law, because it is one point of entry we have for talking with people who don't share our faith convictions, but nevertheless share a basic sort of moral concern for the common good. And so this is going to be an enormously important task in the 21st century. And then finally, no rundown of religious megatrends would be complete without a mention of Pentecostalism. Easily the fastest growing religious movement in the world, far, far faster growing than Islam or any other religious competitor. And it is, in many ways, it has become the most important competitor, so to speak, of Roman Catholicism in many parts of the world, especially the global south. The chart makes the point that if you were to lump all the Pentecostals together, and by the way, the Pentecostals themselves would fight kicking and screaming against doing this. They do not think of themselves as a denomination. They are notoriously independent. But if you were to take all the independent Pentecostal movements out there, the Foursquare Gospel Church and the Assemblies of God and the True Church of Christ in China and the Kerala Pentecostal Revival in India and so forth, you add them all together, you would find they are the second largest denomination in Christianity. There are more Pentecostals than there are other Protestants. There are more Pentecostals than there are Orthodox. There are more Pentecostals than there are Anglicans. Okay? Pentecostals today represent about 20% of the global Christian population. That's up from less than 5% at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay? And even that significantly understates the Pentecostal footprint, because you also have to take account of Pentecostal-style spirituality within established Christian denominations. I mean, in the Catholic world, of course, we call our Pentecostals charismatics. Okay? But it's the same kind of spirituality, premised on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, miracles, healings, the prosperity gospel, and so on. The estimate is that currently somewhere around 12% of the global Catholic population is charismatic, and in many parts of the global south it's over 50%. In Brazil and Chile, for example, more than 50% of the Catholic population is charismatic. In the United States, Hispanic Catholics are 5 times more likely to be charismatic than Anglo-Catholics are, and of course it's the Hispanic percentage of the Catholic population in the United States that's growing. So my point is, in many ways, Pentecostalism is the future. Okay? It is also, of course, in some ways, a serious rival to Catholicism. All right. I want to bring this to a close by trying to sum up what we've talked about in this sense, that it seems to me all of the challenges that we've talked about here tonight, each one of these 10 megatrends, is rich with the potential for creative new responses from the Catholic community in the 21st century. It is also, however, it seems to me, full of consequence for new division, new heartbreak, new heartburn, so to speak, because all of these issues, there are very different ideas about them, of course, in the Catholic world, a very different sense of how we should respond. And really, for the first time in Catholic history, those divisions are going to play themselves out not merely on a regional or a national scale, but they're going to play themselves out on a global scale. And so it seems to me that if we are going to respond well to these challenges, if we are going to harness the astonishing human and social capital that exists in the Catholic world to try to make a contribution to the world of the 21st century, we are going to have to discover a new way of thinking about what it means to be Catholic. And I call this the courage to be globally Catholic. What I mean is we are going to have to stop thinking of our Catholic identity in terms of membership in a particular Catholic tribe, that is, being a conservative Catholic or a liberal Catholic or whatever. And think much more in terms of mere Catholicism, that is, the capacity to harness the best that all of these tribes have to offer. And if you'll allow me, I want to try to drive this point home with one final story. Okay? Some of you know that I grew up in rural western Kansas. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to rural western Kansas. Frankly, I can think of no earthly reason why you should have been. But if you have been, you will know that this is not exactly a thriving crossroads of the tourist industry, huh? I mean, to be honest, about the only time we get significant number of out-of-town visitors is in the fall because it's pheasant hunting season. And there's a certain kind of out-of-town guy who finds the idea of putting on combat fatigues and blasting shotguns, usually while drinking copious amounts of beer, to be a real hoot. To be honest with you, they are usually a far greater threat to one another than they are to the pheasants, but in any event, they come. Okay? To give you a sense of kind of the cultural milieu I'm talking about, my grandparents live in a small western Kansas hamlet called Hill City. It is my candidate for the least aptly named place in America because there is no hill and there certainly is no city. There is one 11-room motel in Hill City. It's called the Western Hills Motel. And it is the only place I have ever stayed. And ladies and gentlemen, I have stayed in some pretty funky lodgings hither and yon. But it's the only place I have ever stayed that has a laminated sign in the bathroom saying, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." Honest to God. Now, this anecdote is set in one weekend during pheasant hunting season. We have an out-of-town guy, let's say he's a lawyer from New York, who has come out to try to bag himself a bird, and he has spent a long and frustrating weekend with no success. And now it's midday on Sunday. He is facing the prospect of having to drive the 300 miles back to Kansas City to fly back to New York and so on. And he decides he's going to take one last shot. So he shoulders his weapon. He sees a pheasant moving across the skyline. He takes aim. He fires. And miracle of miracles, he brings down the bird. Okay? And so now, flushed with triumph, he sets across the field to pick up his trophy. And just as he gets to the spot where the pheasant has fallen, he comes across a barbed wire fence that is very clearly labeled "Private Property, Keep Out." Okay, but he has invested too much blood, toil, tears, and sweat at this stage, so he starts climbing over the fence to pick up his pheasant. And just as he does so, the western Kansas farmer pulls up on his tractor and yells at him, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And the lawyer says, "Well, I'm going to pick up my pheasant." And the farmer says, "No, you're not. That bird fell on my property. It belongs to me." Well, I mean, the lawyer's tired, he's in a hurry, he's frustrated, he's cranky, and he just erupts. He says, "Look, you don't understand. I am a senior partner in a top 10 law firm in New York. If you don't let me have that bird, I'm going to sue you back to the Stone Age." Not realizing this is pretty much where the farmer already is. And the farmer just looks at him and smiles and says, well, look, buddy, that may be how you do things where you come from. But around here, we have a little thing called the 3-kick rule. All right, it's the 3-kick rule. What's that about? It's very simple. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going. Whoever gives up first loses the bird. Lawyer says, well, probably cheaper than a lawsuit. Plus, this guy looks like he's 197 years old. I can probably take him. Says, all right. So they line up next to one another. Now, the farmer, you have to understand, is wearing these heavy, mud-clawed Western Kansas work boots. Okay? Looks at the lawyer and says, are you ready? Lawyer says, yes, I am. Farmer takes one shot in his shins. You know, the lawyer falls to the ground, howling in pain. Farmer gives him another shot in the solar plexus. This time, his cries of agony can be heard to the Nebraska border. Okay? Gives him one last shot under his chin. The lawyer falls back. He's seeing stars. He's barely conscious. But finally, he staggers to his feet. He dusts himself off. He screws this look of grim determination on his face. He looks at the farmer and says, all right, you old coot, now it's my turn. The farmer looks at him, grins, and says, that's all right, you can have the bird. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that too often our conversation in the Catholic community reduces to an ecclesiastical version of the 3-kick rule, where we are not really interested in patient understanding of the other. What we're looking to do is score cheap shots against people we perceive to be our ideological enemies. In fact, I would submit to you that the single tragedy of Catholic history in the United States in the 20th century was that we began the century living in a ghetto that had been imposed upon us by a hostile Protestant majority, which we spent the better part of the first half of the century clawing our way out of. And we have spent the second part of the 20th century reconstructing ghettos of our own ideological choosing. So we have ended the century just as divided as we began, but we are no longer divided from the Protestants anymore. We are divided amongst ourselves. Now, that way of doing business is unappealing, and it is impossible to reconcile with an authentic ecclesiology of communion under any circumstances. But in the world of the 21st century that I have sketched for you, in these dazzling, global, breathtakingly new challenges, that way of thinking about what it means to be Catholic is simply going to be unsustainable. Now, to lead us out of that blind alley, we are going to need the energy, the passion, and the commitment of all of us. This is not principally or primarily a work for our hierarchy to do. This is something that we all have to do together, which means it's going to require the intelligence and the passion of people just such as yourselves, as your chronicler and as your scribe. I look forward to watching you rise to this occasion, which I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that you will. Thank you and God bless.
We just had our Archbishop appointed Cardinal, and
I noticed that.
I like what you said at the very end about various tribes within the Catholic Church need to work together. Is the College of Cardinals reflect that diversity of tribes?
Good. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. No? Basically, the gentleman was picking up on the last point I made, that the various Catholic tribes need to work together, and his question was, does the College of Cardinals reflect that diversity? And, you know, unfortunately, there's no simple answer. I would say the answer is yes and no. I think the college is a lot more representative of the diversity in the Catholic world than people give it credit for. You know, I mean, there's this sort of stereotype out there in the Catholic world that the College of Cardinals is a kind of Stepford Wives environment, right, in which everyone sort of dresses alike and looks alike and thinks alike and acts alike. If you'll forgive me, can I indulge your patience for 1 minute while I tell you one more story? This story, as you may know, when the Pope travels, he travels both as a head of state and also as the head of the Catholic Church. So when he arrives in a foreign country, he's welcomed twice. Once in a very formal setting by the president or prime minister or whatever. Second time by someone on behalf of the local Catholic community, which is usually the local bishop or the primate or whatever. But if it's a very small Catholic country, he's actually welcomed by his nuncio. Okay, that is his own ambassador in that country because it's the only bishop in the country. Okay? This story is set during John Paul's 2002 trip to Azerbaijan, where you may know there are a grand total of 114 Catholics. I actually did the math at the time. It would have been 4 times less expensive to fly all of them to Rome than to bring the Pope to them. But that, of course, wasn't the point. Anyway, So the Pope there was a very small, intimate little welcome where the Archbishop was welcoming him. And I was in the press pool, so I was at the end of one row of seats, and right across from me was a very narrow aisle. Right across from me was the Vatican entourage, the cardinals who travel with the Pope, right? So I was seated right next to a very senior Vatican cardinal, a man I know quite well. I've interviewed him many times. Now this Archbishop, the nuncio, who was giving the welcome, you got to understand, a salt-of-the-earth guy, but had a reputation as a bit of a windbag. Huh? Had that remarkable Italian oratorical capacity to go on, and the miracle of it is without ever saying anything, right? And he was in rare form this day. I clocked the greeting at 40 minutes. And bear in mind, this was a 24-hour trip. We thought the Pope would be in Rome before this guy was done welcoming him to Baku. Anyway, so as this oration is winding on, this cardinal friend of mine, I can tell, is getting increasingly frustrated. Right? You can tell these things, right? Because his breathing was becoming labored, and he began, the rhythm at which he was checking his watch was picking up, and so on. And so at one stage, I decided to give him a chance to vent. So I leaned across the aisle and I said, "Cardinal, what do you think?" Okay, well, there was this nanosecond of hesitation. You could tell he's calculating, should I say this or should I not say it? But it was obvious he needed to get this out. So he leaned into the aisle, and in this sotto voce fashion, looking up at this Italian Monsignore going on and saying nothing, the cardinal whispered to me, "You realize that some Italian village is missing its idiot." Honest to God, true story. Now, I tell this story not only because it's a once-in-a-career punchline, although it is, but because it makes the point that actually, the College of Cardinals does not get nearly the credit for the internal diversity it contains that it deserves, because, only from afar can it seem like a monolith. Huh? When you see it on an up-close and personal basis, what reveals itself is its diversity. You actually have an enormous range of life experiences and personalities and temperaments and so on in that group. Okay, ranging from Cardinal Teresa Sandoval of Bolivia, who is a member of is an indigenous person from Bolivia who grew up out in the bush. Cardinal Lorenzi, whose parents are converts to Catholicism from African animism, essentially spirit worship, to people who grew up in traditional Catholic cultures and on and on. And you've got people who are quite fussy in their outlook and people who are fairly progressive in their outlook and on and on. Now, look, does the diversity within the College of Cardinals represent the broader diversity opinion in the whole Catholic world? No. Of course it doesn't. Just in the same sense, I don't know that the United States Senate represents the full range of political opinion at the grassroots of the United States, but you wouldn't expect it to, I think the one way in which the college is still remarkably unrepresentative that is going to have to get some attention as the 21st century rolls on is that while 2/3 of our people today come from the global south, 2/3 of our cardinals come from the global north. As of November 24th, when Cardinal Designate, then on that day, Cardinal DiNardo, gets his red hat, there will be 121 cardinal electors, that is, cardinals eligible to vote for the next pope because they're under 80. Of those 121, 61 are European, exactly half. And when you add in the 16 Americans and Canadians together, that total rises to 77, huh? In other words, it's 2/3. So 2/3 of our cardinals come from the north, 2/3 of our people come from the south. I think over the course of time, there's going to have to be some balancing of that. Okay? So in other words, it is more representative than people understand. It is perhaps less representative than ideally it might be.
The Senate says, in the 21st century, we're going to have a key virtue, and that's the courage to be globally Catholic. Are we going to get to that point ourselves? You've showed statistics, bar graphs of the various religions that profess to be Catholic, Christian in their outlook. And you also using a term in some of your notes, ecumenical jihad. Obviously, the courage to be globally Catholic, we're opposing some influence in the world. Do we get there by ourselves, by having the courage to be Catholic, or do we get there through ecumenical jihad? Would you explain the term? And
yeah.
It's a term that's being used quite a bit, and I wonder if you would extend on that subject.
Sure.
Are we getting there with others, or are we going to do it alone?
Well, I think the answer, quite obviously, is both. The Holy Father gave a fascinating address to the priests of northern Italy a couple of months ago, in which he was asked about the split in the Catholic world between the guy wasn't using this language, but basically it was liberals and conservatives is what he was talking about. And the Holy Father's response was that the great Catholic genius is that we are both and rather than either or. That is, the Catholic spirit is synthesis. We are looking to pick up the best. So, I think it's a false opposition to say that the courage to be globally Catholic will be summoned either from within or from without. I think quite obviously both have to happen at the same time. Now, you asked about the phrase ecumenical jihad. I didn't stop and talk about it because I was already radically over time. But the phrase comes from a book written by a Catholic philosopher by the name of Peter Kreeft. Now, this was before 9/11. I'm not sure Peter would use the same title today. But essentially, Peter's argument was that in the world in which we find ourselves, on the level of moral, social, and cultural issues, quite often religious believers, serious religious believers of any sort, have more in common with one another than they do with secularists, and in some cases, the avant-garde forces in their own religious communities. And so Peter's argument, for example, was that Christians and Muslims can do a great deal together on the global stage in terms of defending human dignity, defending the family, and so on. I remember Peter talked about, some of you may know that in the mid-90s, the UN sponsored two very high-profile conferences, one in Cairo on population and one in Beijing on women. The Cairo conference was 94, Beijing was 95. At both of those meetings, there was a very serious push to essentially to create an internationally recognized right to abortion. And those efforts were blocked by a coalition of traditionally Catholic nations led by the Holy See, working in concert with a number of majority Islamic states. And Peter described that as a greater victory with Islam than the Battle of Lepanto in the 16th century was against Islam. I think that's the vision, that in this new world, there is, first of all, an urgent priority inside the Catholic community to recover an authentic sense of Catholic identity, to reinforce for ourselves, speaking among and to ourselves, what it means to be Catholic, and drawing on the best of all the various expressions of Catholicity. So that has to go on. But at the same time, it can't be done. We can't disengage from the rest of the world and pretend there aren't other communities out there and there aren't urgent questions that need our witness. So both of these things have to happen at the same time, would be my answer. Now, the other question, will we get there? Look, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I didn't pack it with me tonight. What I will tell you, I'll tell you how we're not going to get there. Okay? How we're not going to get there is operating under the assumption that nothing can change in the way we think about ourselves and the way we practice our faith unless it first comes down from on high. That, this is this sort of purple ecclesiology, right? That, the bishops are both the cause of and the solution to all our problems. And, nothing can be done until the bishop gives us instructions. Look, ladies and gentlemen, here's the reality of the Catholic world, okay? The fundamental job description of a bishop in this church is to ensure that when Christ returns, the faith will still be found upon the earth. It is, by definition, in many ways, a cautious, conservative, defensive charism. And it is utterly unrealistic to expect, as a rule, those people who are charged with being the last line of defense for the faith also to constantly be the ones who are providing the vision and creative new energy in the church. Okay? That kind of passivity won't cut it. If we are going to summon the will to build this courage to be globally Catholic, it is obviously a work that has to be done in concert, in heartfelt communion with our leaders, but it is not a task that we can afford to dislodge to our leadership. Something that all of us have to build together, and I think Catholic university communities have an enormously important role to play in that regard. So my point is, sitting around and waiting for somebody else to come up with the ideas, that's how not to get it done. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I thought your statistics were very interesting about the older population that we're going to be challenged with to make our liturgies and our churches relevant. As a high school Catholic educator, I see the challenges in the youth today, the spiritual but not religious aspect. How then are we going to balance keeping our faith alive for an elderly population with our youth that are leaving denominations of almost or any sort of institutional aspect? How do you see the church being able to handle both aspects there?
Well, the first thing I would say is that this obviously cannot be framed as a choice between elder ministry and youth ministry, between a focus on the elderly and a focus on the young. I mean, again, it has to be a both-and response. But I think there is a kind of, two birds with one stone sort of solution here, which is that one of the critical tasks of the future is not going to be working out the nuts and bolts of how do we fund Social Security and Medicaid. I mean, as critically important as all those things are. But at the level of the parish level, the level of faith communities, it's going to be sustaining basic human solidarity. I mean, basically the ratio of elderly to young people is shifting dramatically, skewing dramatically towards the older end of the spectrum, which means that the caregivers that traditionally exist, either in homes or communities, okay, to simply spend time with elderly people, to make sure they continue to be engaged and involved and so on. That sort of activity that has traditionally gone on in the family, there simply are not going to be young people in the family to be able to do that on a fairly wide scale. So I would think one of the really creative forms of ministry that would happen in the future is a kind of intergenerational ministry that would try to pair our young people with our elderly people in ways that, my point is, we just can't count on that happening in the natural course of events. And if any institution in society has this kind of social capital to make that happen, I think it would be churches. And so I think and that sort of gets around the very real phenomenon you talk about, which is there's a deep spiritual hunger among many young people, but sometimes an allergy against institutional religion. This kind of ministry, doesn't force them in some ways to, well, it doesn't demand structure. In the sense of that structured forms of religious activity sometimes do. What it does do is put them in contact with elder people who, one would hope, can sort of transmit life experience, including spiritual wisdom, and that perhaps a kind of deeper sense of spiritual openness and a capacity to see the good, even inside institutional forms of spirituality, can somehow be enkindled through that exchange. So that's one sort of very practical thing that I would be looking at. Yes, sir. So the question is, what do I see going on in terms of the Christian ecumenical movement, the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion and others? First of all, I would say that broadly speaking, the rise of evangelical Catholicism means that the ecumenism written large is to some extent less of a priority now than it was in the immediate post-Vatican II period. I think the immediate post-Vatican II instinct was rush out and meet the other wherever he or she can be found. I think there's a bit more attention now to fostering the internal life of the Church, which, and this is not a matter of ill will on anybody's part, and certainly not a matter of choosing against ecumenism, but it simply means, leaders have to make choices, and in terms of where the leadership of the Church is investing its time and treasure, broadly speaking, I think there's slightly less attention. And that is a global point. Now, each of the specific relationships you mentioned has its own complexities. I mean, the Anglican Communion seems to be in the process of deconstructing to some extent. I think, therefore, relations at a formal level are sort of on hold until we see how things shake out inside the Anglican Communion. I think with the Orthodox, that's an enormously complex relationship, and there's a kind of one step forward, two step back dynamic about it that really has less to do with theology or ecclesiology than it does with grievances against the West and against the Catholic Church as an embodiment in the minds of many Orthodox of Western imperialism and so on. And I think that's a generational question. I would not expect rapid progress, in terms of moving towards full, visible communion. Where I do think some interesting things are going to happen in the 21st century is in ecumenical relations with Pentecostalism. And the reason it's going to have to happen is because they are the growing Christian other. And in many parts of the Christian world, Catholicism or Pentecostalism are competitors to the Catholic Church. I mean, do you realize in Latin America in the 20th century, more people became Protestants in Latin America in the 20th century than became Protestants in Europe during the 16th century of the Protestant Reformation? Vast majority of them became Pentecostal. So we are, to use kind of crude, mercenary language, we're losing market share. But at the same time, the kind of paradox of that is that new competition is also, I think, awakening something inside Catholicism in Latin America. My experience is that many churches in Latin America may be somewhat reduced in size, but they are far more alive than they were a generation ago. Vocations to the priesthood are going up. Vocations to the religious life are going up. Mass attendance rates are going up. I'm enough of an American to believe, frankly, that a little bit of competition is a healthy thing. So the relationship with Pentecostalism, I think, will become the defining ecumenical relationship of the 21st century, and it will be a complex one, because on the one hand, we will be learning a great deal from the Pentecostals. As I said earlier, we have our own form of Pentecostalism in some ways in the charismatic movement, which creates a kind of natural ecumenism. There's a guy in Guatemala, Oscar Rosario, who is a lay preacher. I'm sorry, Honduras. Does that mean the fourth quarter's over? What just happened? Oscar is a Catholic charismatic lay preacher. And he speaks in soccer stadiums all over Central America, attracts huge crowds. And I would say probably 60 or 70% of the people who come to listen to him are Pentecostals. They're not Catholics. Okay? They're ex-Catholics in many cases, but they're practicing Pentecostals. Oscar likes to joke. They always come up to him and say, "Great preaching, brother. Hard to believe you're still Catholic." You know? So there's a kind of natural ecumenism at the grassroots. On the other hand, these rivalries that exist, the competition for followers and so on, mean these relationships are kind of frayed. And there are some currents in the Pentecostal world that are just rabidly anti-Catholic. When I was in Uganda, I was interviewing the Secretary General of the Ugandan Bishops' Conference, and I asked him to describe relationships with the Pentecostals. He said, "Oh, you want to know about Pentecostals, huh?" He took me out of his office, took me down the street to the Pentecostal megachurch, which had this huge billboard out front, which said, "Come for Sunday's sermon, the 7 sins of the Catholic Church." But that's our relationship with the Pentecostals, So it's going to be a fractious, difficult, complex relationship, but one that I think is in many ways going to revitalize Catholicism at the grassroots. Again, I think there is a basic reality that in religion, as in every other walk of life, monopolies tend to become lazy and inefficient. I think that's what happened in Latin America. I think that's what happened in Europe. And I think the competition from Pentecostalism across much of the world, and in some ways the competition from secularity in Europe, is reawakening the church. Ultimately, I'm enough of an optimist to believe that that'll be a positive thing. Yes? Jim's question is, in the effort to build bridges with Islam and have dialogue with Islam, would we also inadvertently slip into a kind of relativism, where kind of one religion is as good as another, that kind of thing? There are some theological currents in the church that flirt with that, and actually, I think all of the most recent high-profile disciplinary cases that have come from the Vatican of theologians have, in one way or another, focused on this. The Belgian Jesuit Jacques Dupuy, the American Jesuit Roger Haight. These are all people who are working in the area of religious pluralism, and where the danger was they can end up saying that there's no ultimate difference between being Christian or being anything else. So I think the Holy See is very attentive to kind of drawing the line on that. I think certainly you are not going to get religious relativism under this pontificate. If there's one thing I will tell you can take to the bank, okay, this Pope is not going to lose the war against the dictatorship of relativism. Okay? I think what you're seeing evolve, because for the very reason, the very question you raise, I think you're seeing evolve a new style in approaches to interreligious relationships from the Catholic side. I think in the immediate post-Vatican II period, our interest was moving immediately to theological conversation. And we wanted to have these big doctrinal consultations, and then we would come up with these phrases like, we're all children of Abraham, or we're all people of the book, we all believe in the one God, all of which are nice bumper stickers, but none of which are completely true. We are not people of a book, we are people of a person, God incarnate in the form of Jesus Christ. The book is one form of the revelation that he brought to us, but it's a person, not the book. And yes, we both believe in one God, but we believe in one God who is also triune. They don't. So you know what I mean? These formula run the risk of sounding nice, but glossing over some very real differences that have to be taken account of. I think what you're seeing now at the leadership level of the church is a style of interreligious relationship that is less interested in theological exchange and more interested in what we can do on the social, cultural, and political level. Okay, those areas where we share common values. And I think you see this, Benedict quite clearly. He appointed a diplomat to run the Council for Interreligious Dialogue, not a theologian. Precisely because he doesn't want to court the risk of a kind of relativistic, one is as good as another approach to this dialogue. He wants to respect the differences that exist, but also acknowledge those areas where we can work together. Now, that's Benedict's idea. How it plays out is a whole different story, but I think that's the blueprint. Yes?
Could you venture a guess as to why there's so many more Catholics per priest in you mentioned Caribbean and South America, places like that? Is it the money, or what is it?
Good question. So the young man's question is, why is the priest to Catholic ratio so much higher in other parts of the world than it is in Europe and North America? Okay. Basic reason is that in most of the rest of the world, they are baptizing people far more quickly than they are ordaining them. I mean, the church in South Korea has doubled as a percentage of the Korean population in the last 20 years alone. You know, in northeast India, the church is growing like gangbusters and so on. Again, Africa, you know, almost 7,000% growth in the last 100 years. So that even though they are generating new vocations, they are not nearly enough to keep up, you know, with the population. That's number one. Number two, Europe and North America have always been priest-rich, historically speaking. I mean, look, there is a basic practical reality, which is that we are the developed, affluent part of the world. We have more doctors, we have more engineers, we have more rocket scientists, and we also have more priests. You know, it's not fair, but there it is. Okay? Very basic reality. Yes, sir. Okay, so the gentleman's question is, militant atheism in the form of Richard Dawkins and people like that seems to be enjoying a kind of, you know, Prague Spring. Is that a threat to the future? I think in Europe in some ways it is. But I think that kind of, you know, hostile secular atheism as a grassroots phenomenon doesn't exist anywhere outside of Europe. Okay? When you look at all the polling data about the United States, you know, this remains a stubbornly religious country. Okay, there is no grassroots secular atheism in this country. There are sort of narrow circles of opinion that you can find in the media and in universities and in, you know, the entertainment industry and so on. But it does not in any sense represent a kind of Main Street USA phenomenon. There's a sociologist, an Austrian sociologist, who spent most of his career in Boston by the name of Peter Berger, who has a great phrase. What he says is that sociologically speaking, from the point of view of religion, the United States is a country of Indians. He means Asian Indians. It's a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. What he means is that we are an enormously religious country, and we have a class of elite class, the people who make culture and so on, who are remarkably secularized. Okay, so there's a tremendous difference. So look, you know, I think the kind of point of view that Dawkins represents, it's there in the culture. It has a certain influence in intellectual and cultural circles, and certainly the church has to take note of it. But if you want my candidate for the real issue facing Catholicism in the 21st century, it is not secularism and it's not atheism. It is the competition bred by healthy religious diversity, because that is the dominant global reality. I mean, you go into Asia, you go into Latin America, you go into, there are no secular atheists. I mean, you might, you know, if you really wanted to go to the major university in Nairobi and find one, you could probably knock on enough doors to find one. Okay? But as a sociologically significant reality, they don't exist. The problem we are facing and the challenge we are facing is not the competition from secular atheism. It is the competition from other equally motivated, you know, dynamic, evangelizing religious forces. One of my favorite examples is China. I'll end on this note because I know we're running over time. China is in many ways the last great missionary frontier on earth. It's a country of more than 1 billion people where there is a deep spiritual hunger. I mean, basically speaking, obvious, you know, communism as an ideological system has collapsed. I mean, it's nothing other than a political structure. No one really believes in communism anymore. But at the same time, you know, 4 generations of official state atheism have done their job in many ways in terms of eradicating the earlier spiritual traditions that once gave meaning and direction to Chinese life at the popular level. So there is an enormous kind of spiritual vacuum there, and that vacuum is being filled by a lot of different forces today. In the west of China, Islam is growing at an astonishing pace, and it's growing beyond the traditionally Islamic tribes of western China. There are now converts from other Chinese communities that are not traditionally Islamic, large numbers of them. Kind of revived Confucianism is growing rapidly. And the single most rapid growing spiritual movement in China today is Pentecostal Christianity. The most conservative estimates are that there are about 40 million Pentecostals in China today. That's as opposed to less than 1 million in 1949 at the time of the communist takeover. And the most liberal estimates are it's about 100 million. Okay. Numbers are that there are about 10,000 Chinese people today who convert to Christianity, and mostly Pentecostals, every day. Every day there are 10,000 new Christians made in China. It's one of the great evangelical success stories of the 20th and early 21st centuries. That's the good news. The bad news is that most of that growth has largely bypassed the Catholic Church. Catholic Church, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, had about 6 or 7 million Catholics. At the time of the end of the Cultural Revolution, in the late 80s, early 90s, had about 12 or 13 million. In other words, the Church largely kept pace with overall demographic growth. It did not expand at all. Okay? So the good news is that there is an enormous missionary opportunity in China at the moment. The bad news is we're not really exploiting it. And it's a complex, I mean, we could talk all night about why not. It's a complex situation. But my point is, that's the challenge. Okay? Not too many people, to be honest with you, outside very rarefied circles, are being converted by Richard Dawkins. Lots of people on the face of this planet are being converted by Pentecostal preachers. And if you where our energy should go, that's it. Okay? Is that it, sister?